Welcome back to the discussion, Taking Action to Ensure Fairness and Equity in Housing, How Government and the Real Estate Industry Can Work Together, sponsored by Bright MLS on WTOP.com. My guests today are Amit Kulkarni, the Chief Marketing Officer for Bright MLS, Dr. Lisa Sturtevant, the Chief Economist for Bright MLS, and Congressman Glenn Ivey, the U.S. Representative for Maryland's 4th District. And we've been talking about a lot of issues. Some of them are very complex, some of them straightforward. But for people that don't really know what a pocket listing is, we talked about that in the first segment. Why don't we circle back and if you could explain, Amit, what exactly a pocket listing is?
So a pocket listing happens in a case when an agent or broker withholds a listing from the open marketplace and just markets it internally within their own brokerage to sell it within the own brokerage. Generally, we don't think that's a good idea because it really excludes a large portion of the home buying public from the experience of that listing. And when we think about the depressed inventory levels over these past probably 3 or 4 years, I think it's critically important that all the buyers have access to all the inventory available, not just ones that you or me or Lisa or Congressman Ivey think that they should have access to. So I think the whole notion of a pocket listing goes counter to the idea of fair housing. Another name for pocket listing is exclusive listing, which is the opposite of inclusivity.
And related to these issues, I was looking at figures, and the Housing Affordability Index is apparently at its lowest point in nearly 40 years. The median price just a few years ago of a home across the country, I know they're higher in this area, but $280,000 now. Well over $400,000. I wonder if you could talk about how significant this change has been in the last few years.
Absolutely. And here in the Washington area, for example, we've seen home prices up 40, 50%. And at the same time that home prices are rising over the last couple of years, mortgage rates have also more than doubled. And so we have just seen over the last 10 years or so that just housing costs have increased much faster than incomes have. And then there's been much more demand for housing because of this young millennial population coming into their first-time home buying age. We've seen the level of new construction be very low, which means the level of supply that's out there has not increased to meet demand. And so what that means for a first-time home buyer in particular is finding it very, very hard to get into a home. Qualifying for a mortgage takes an average of more than $125,000 for the typical home. And that is just out of reach for many young people who are looking to become a homeowner in this particular market.
And Congressman, we've been talking about, you have grown children. You've seen this firsthand with your sons and daughters trying to figure out how they would buy a home.
Yeah, they show up with the guarantor document for us to sign. Not all of them, but obviously the ability for the parents to help is a big factor. I think for a lot of their contemporaries, those are the ones that are able to buy into the housing market at this point. There's some, like my oldest child, my daughter, who are they're older, so they've had more time to accumulate the wealth. But for people in their late 20s, early 30s, it's tough. And even if you get the down payment, the monthly can be very challenging too.
Just to pick up on what Congressman Ivey said was this idea of first-time buyers who are able to get help from parents. That's really hard if your parents weren't able to access homeownership, right? This intergenerational transfer of wealth that's really critical to a first-time home buyer right now is really reserved for those who have been fortunate enough to access homeownership in the past. And so understanding that it's not just about today's young people who want to buy a home, but it's really about how wealth moves from one generation to the next through homeownership. That's really important.
Yeah, it makes me think of how many of us have had this conversation with neighbors or friends where they say, wow, I couldn't buy in my neighborhood today if I had to. And I've heard that so many times from so many people. And those people feel fortunate that we were able to buy a home at a certain time. So Amit, what is the real estate industry doing to make sure to deal with potentially discriminatory practices?
Today the MLS is really kind of the most important piece to the whole notion of fair and equitable access to housing. But there's a lot more we can be doing together with state, local, and federal legislators. And we'd love to see some state-level bills that would really enhance consumer protections from a variety of angles. There's really three things that we think would be helpful and important. The first one being requiring real estate brokers to offer to advertise and perform services on an impartial basis. Number two, Make sure that the brokers offer unbiased access to all the property information. And then finally, require the brokers provide transparency throughout the whole process. So it's really those three fundamental things. And if we can work together with state, local, and federal legislators to help kind of bake these things into state law, I think that would be really, really critical to enhance those consumer protections so that we can ensure that every consumer, regardless of their station in life, race, color, creed, whatever, has access to every home for sale.
And going back to what Congressman Ivey said about redlining, looking at the Fair Housing Act, which covered a lot of these issues, do you feel that it's still holding up, or do we still need some reforms and tinkering around the edges related to it?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that we still need to work on access to housing, for sure. And we don't want to do anything that takes us backwards. And I think that's what we've sort of been emphasizing about the ability of the MLS to make sure that there's transparent and complete information for everyone. We don't want to take that away because that would be taking a step backwards. And while there is less explicit discrimination in the housing market by almost any measure that you can see, there's still implicit discrimination. There still is a lack of transparency in who has access to information. And I think, as Amit mentioned, the MLS and the real estate industry more generally, we want to work together with local, state, and federal government to make sure that everybody has access to the same information, that we can see what's going on in the transaction so that nobody is excluded from the process. And I think there is more that can be done to continue to ensure that transparency in the market.
Yeah, what are your thoughts?
You also need enforcement when there is actual discrimination, whether it's implicit or explicit. At Home Mortgage Disclosure Act provides the information over generations that's been useful on that front. And sometimes federal officials, whether it's Department of Justice or sometimes the federal banking regulators, use that kind of information to identify problems. It might be a redlining issue in a community, and we've had some of those pop up over the last few years, or just individual. And sometimes the Department of Justice has to intervene on those, or state officials too. But it's still a challenge. We still have to make sure that they have the tools to enforce those things. There's some challenges coming from the courts on that front that I think are going to get bigger. But in the meantime, I think we need to make sure we give the executive branches the ability to enforce.
And when you say it might be getting tougher in the courts, is it just because of the makeup of the courts and the way they're looking at some of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. There's a reluctance for the courts to look at, starting with the Supreme Court, frankly, race as a factor. I think they're trying to push that to the side as much as they can. And I know there are a lot of people who feel that's fine, but to the extent you then have trouble enforcing racial discrimination issues because, for example, if you're not collecting data, that creates an additional problem and exacerbates an issue that's been there for generations here in the United States. And
I would think it's got to be difficult for just the average person that's looking for a home, say a minority family looking for a home, and they get a feeling, in their gut, like, I feel like I'm getting kind of cut out of this neighborhood, or somebody doesn't want me here, or they're trying to steer me to another area. Is that a hard thing to prove legally and to get the wheels going on? Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that there's maybe a lot of a neighborhood that's one race or another doesn't mean there's causation there sufficient to prove racial discrimination. So in the past they called them testers. They'd be people who would go out and they'd line them up. They'd have a black individual, white individual, make sure all the characteristics are as similar as possible and see if they get different treatment. But the courts are now cutting back on the ability to use testers and to use that information in court proceedings. So it could really hamstring these kinds of civil rights prosecutions. One of the things that came up in connection with affordability, as you well know, is a lot of people in Prince George's County and a lot of people in the Washington area ended up upside down on their mortgages. Do you think enough reforms and things have been done in the past few years since we kind of hit the peak of that? What's being done moving forward, I guess? Yeah, during the last financial crisis, the housing market crisis, there was a significant number of foreclosures in the market. Prince George's County was really ground zero for the foreclosure activity in the Washington area. And as you point out, many people just getting out from underwater, now 15 years later. The reforms that were made in the mortgage industry, though, have gone a long way to ensuring that there are very few subprime loans in the market right now.
the risk of major foreclosure activity in the market is very low right now. Underwriting standards are much tighter than they were before. And so while some people might say that those tighter underwriting standards have limited people's access to home ownership, what it's really done is prepared people to be better and more successful homeowners. And that's good for the market, that's good for the home buyers and the homeowners themselves. And we're in a much, much different situation than we were 15 years ago. Our biggest challenge right now is that there's just a lack of inventory for all the qualified buyers who are out there who do want to buy a home.
And to that point, Amit, the MLS, as you've mentioned, really tries to get people so they know every possible property out there.
That's correct, and I think the data supports it. 85 to 90% of transactions annually are done through the MLS. There's these portals and all these other vehicles people use. I call it infotainment. But when the rubber meets the road and you really need to make a purchase decision that costs real dollars and cents, and that can have a 12 to 14 year impact on your life, you're going to work with an agent through the MLS because those are the folks that are really going to help you find that place for you to call home. And it's really important that when you go through that process, you have access to everything, not just the select few that somebody thinks you should have access to.
And we've talked about a lot of the challenges, but we'd also like to talk about some of the positive things that have been happening, which we've touched on a little bit, and we'll hit on that in our final segment. Again, my guests are Amit Kulkarni, the Chief Marketing Officer for Bright MLS, Dr. Lisa Sturtevant, the Chief Economist for Bright MLS, and Congressman Glenn Ivey, the U.S. Representative for Maryland's 4th District. I'm Mitchell Miller, your moderator.